everybody, Miss Callan here with Ship, and today we're going to be learning about cooking in ancient Egypt. So we're going to be making a warm lentil salad, and lentils were something that the ancient Egyptians ate all the time. They grew lentils and they were a great source of protein for them. So before we get started on the recipe, we're going to learn a little bit about food and agriculture in ancient Egypt. So in ancient Egypt, everything about agriculture depended on the Nile, and it depended on how much rain they got that year. So when they had lots of rain, the Nile filled up with water and they were able to irrigate their fields. And they developed a method of irrigation called basin irrigation, where they would flood the fields with the Nile's water and then let the water soak into the ground, and then they were able to plant crops there. If they had a year that had a drought, it meant that many fields could not be planted. But around the Nile, agriculture in ancient Egypt was very productive, and they usually had surplus from a previous year that they had stored over the winter, and they had into the next year if they had a drought year. Let's talk a bit about grains and bread. In ancient Egypt, they made flatbread out of wheat. And just like in ancient China, we found out that rice is from the grass plant family, so is wheat. Wheat is a grass plant too. And the ancient Egyptians learned how to make bread using flour, which they ground from the seeds of the grass, wheat. So it would have been kind of a rough flour, a whole grain flour. And they used water, and then they used yeast. And the yeast was wild yeast that came into the bread as it was sitting and rising and caused it to actually rise more. And they would bake the bread over a fire in clay ovens, often where they would press the bread up against the edges of the oven. And today, sometimes that method is still used today to bake bread in the Middle East. So grain was so important in ancient Egypt that many people's wages were paid in grain. And even though they used copper as a form of currency for money, they could also go shopping with wheat. So they could go and buy, say, a pair of sandals with a bag of wheat. That's how important grain was. So let's talk about the other food groups too. We've talked about grains, and we're going to look at how the ancient Egyptians found their protein, their vegetables, their fruits, and their dairy. So for protein, the ancient Egyptians had lots of options, and they grew a lot of their protein. They grew lentils and chickpeas. And lentils and chickpeas are in the legume family, so they are basically a bean or a pea. And they are so great to have because they are a plant that provides a lot of protein. And they don't even require much to grow because they produce their own fertilizer. If you look at the picture that has the roots showing, you can see little balls on those roots, and that is where these little bacteria called rhizobium live. And in the soil, the rhizobium take nitrogen out of the air in the soil and give it to the plant. So that means that the plant is getting really fertilizer from those bacteria, and the bacteria are getting sugar from the plant. So the ancient Egyptians grew lots and lots of lentils and chickpeas, and they were able to store those for a long time too, because those are dry beans. So that's another great advantage of this kind of protein, is you can really store it for a long time. But the ancient Egyptians also had lots of fish from the Nile. They had abundant fish, and they also ate wild birds, and they had game birds too, like ducks and wild geese. And then they had some domesticated animals too, cattle, pigs, goats, and sheep. So the richer families would have had access to lots of different kinds of protein from meat. And other families would have had the legumes we talked about, and fish from the Nile, and probably some eggs. Okay, so fruits and vegetables were also abundant in ancient Egypt, and today we're going to be working with dates. Dates grow on a big, huge palm tree that makes tons and tons of dates, and they're full of sugar and vitamins and minerals, so they would have been really loved by the ancient Egyptians. They also had fruits like figs and grapes and raisins and carob. And for sweet, they would have had some honey too, but they would not have had sugar. They didn't grow sugar. So they would have been having dates and honey for sweet. Okay, what about vegetables? The ancient Egyptians had lots of greens like lettuce, and they had celery and cucumber. They had parsley, which we're going to use today, and they also made use of a lot of different spices. They used spices like coriander. Coriander comes from the plant cilantro. In these pictures, you can see the spices that we're going to use today. So you can see the coriander on the top, and then the cardamom, and the fennel with the yellow flowers, and the cumin with the white flowers. For dairy, the ancient Egyptians did make some soft cheeses. They might have used cow or goat milk for their cheeses, and they would have had like cottage cheese. They might have also made yogurt, and they probably made butter and also probably drank their milk. So today we're going to be using a soft cream cheese for our dessert. So how do we know what the ancient Egyptians ate? Well, we have lots of beautiful paintings that are on the tombs and coffins of people who were buried. And if they were a rich person, they would have had an elaborate painting that would have shown all sorts of different foods that they were hoping that the person could have eaten in the afterworld when they were already dead. And they also buried people with their last meal. And so archaeologists have been able to find evidence through those means to figure out some of the things that the ancient Egyptians ate. In these pictures, if you take a close look, you can see grapes and bread and meat. Okay, so here's the recipe that we're going to be using today. We're making a warm lentil salad with lots and lots of fun spices to try, and then a fun dessert out of dates. So let's get started. Let's talk about the ingredients we're going to be using today and their food groups. So we're going to be using lentils, and lentils are in what food group? Did you guess protein? They're a protein. They're like a bean or a pea, and so they're going to be a protein for us. And then we're going to eat this dish with some flatbread, and this is pita bread. And pita bread falls under grains, right? It's made out of wheat. So we've got wheat and grains. And then we're going to be using a big bunch of parsley. And so parsley is a vegetable. So we've got a vegetable in here too. And then we're going to go ahead and make a dessert. And the dessert is going to include dates. And dates are a fruit. They're very sweet. And they grow in ancient Egypt, or they grew in ancient Egypt. And we're going to be using some cream cheese. And that falls under dairy. And so that means we have how many food groups? Protein, grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy. Wow, we have all 5 food groups today. First, we're going to cook the lentils, and we're going to cook them pretty quickly because we don't want them to be mushy like for lentil soup. We want them to be al dente, and that means chewy in Italian. So we're going to use 1 cup of lentils, dry lentils. Measure that out. Okay, and then what we have to do is give these a quick rinse just in case they have any dirt on them or anything from the farm. Okay, we've rinsed our lentils. Now we're going to put them in a pot, and then we're going to add about 4 cups of cold water, and we're going to boil them and let them simmer for 25 minutes. And we're going to start the timer from the time that we put the cold water and lentils on the stove because we really are trying to make sure these lentils don't come out mushy. All right, and we can add a dash of salt to the water too. Okay, let's put it on the stove. While the lentils are boiling, that gives us a lot of time to work on the other ingredients. So we're going to start with parsley, and we need a 1/4 cup of parsley. Parsley was probably grown in ancient Egypt. It was definitely grown in ancient Greece, and it probably made its way down to ancient Egypt too. So we can use this in our recipe. And we can actually chop this up with scissors, which makes it super easy. So let's first chop off some of these stiffer ends. So we'll remove some of the stems and just leave the nice leafy green part. I mean, the stems are okay too, but they can be a little bit tough. Now, pick up your bunch of parsley and start snipping it into tiny pieces with your scissors. Look how easy that is. What a great way to chop up herbs. Just make sure you keep your fingers out of the way of the scissors. Take our 1/4 cup and let's measure that and see. There we go. There's a mounding 1/4 cup. So I'm going to place it in this bowl for later. The lentils are starting to boil, so I'm going to turn it down to medium. Okay, the next thing we're going to get ready is garlic. So you can take a head of garlic and take off a couple of cloves. And an easy way to get garlic started is to crack it with a knife. And you take the flat part of the knife and press it right on top of the clove. Put your hand on top of the flat knife and press down. And then what you've got is a cracked garlic clove. That makes it really easy to peel. Garlic and onions and scallions would have all been growing in ancient Egypt that they could have used for flavorings for their food. So to chop up the garlic, this is something better for an adult to do because you need a sharp knife. Scissors won't work too great on this. You could try to use a plastic knife on the garlic too. Garlic is not too hard. It'll just take a lot longer with a plastic knife. Now we get to talk about the spices. So one really fun thing about this recipe is we get to take a look at a lot of different spices that were used in ancient Egypt. They used a lot of fragrant, beautiful spices in ancient Egypt. So here we have some whole seeds. These spices grow on plants, and they're actually the seeds of the plants, so that if they were fresh seeds and we planted them, they might actually even grow. And this is cardamom, which is really delicious and fragrant. Now for this recipe, we can use the actual seeds and we can grind them up. We can grind them up like they might have in ancient Egypt with a mortar and pestle. And you can just throw your different seeds in and smash them around for a long time and grind them up and get very, very fresh spices to work with. We can also grind them up in a coffee grinder, electric, much easier. And even easier than that, we can use just the dry spices that we have. But let's take a look at the different seeds. We've got fennel. These little fennel seeds smell a little bit like anise or licorice candy. Take a look at those. Wouldn't it be fun to plant these and see if they actually grew? We've got cumin, which looks a lot like fennel actually. This is a spice that we use a little bit more here because we also use it in Mexican food. We've got some cumin seeds, and then we've got coriander. These are little round ones. And these are actually the seed of the cilantro plant. So the cilantro plant makes two totally different kinds of spices. It's much easier to just use the dry spices that are already ground, so we don't have to grind them up. But just for fun, let's go ahead and grind these up. Cooks often use fresh spices and grind them themselves because then the fragrances are so much nicer. So we need about a 1/4 teaspoon of cardamom. So we'll put that right in. I'm going to use the electric version. Then we need a 1/2 teaspoon of coriander. Then we need about a 1/3 teaspoon of fennel. And I'm just going to make it a little bit less than a 1/2 teaspoon. That'll be a 1/3 teaspoon. And then we need a 1/2 teaspoon of cumin. We can sprinkle regular pepper in too, but I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of these peppercorns too. There we go. Okay. Now, let me grind it up. Okay, so our spices are all ground up. Now the cardamom seed pods have a little papery coating, so I'm just going to take some of those out of there. Okay, now we can measure out a little bit of salt. So we're going to do about 1/3 of a teaspoon, and that's just a little bit less than 1/2. And then we need our olive oil. So we need 1/4 cup of olive oil. Measure that out. Have that ready. The ancient Egyptians would have used oil from safflower and other plants, and in later years they would have used olive oil, which they probably would have gotten from the Mediterranean area. Okay, I think our lentils are almost done. Let's go check and see how they are. Mine are still a little hard, so I'm going to put them on for another 5 minutes. Okay, while the lentils are cooking, we have one quick thing to do with our spices. We're going to toast up our spices and garlic in this olive oil to really bring out their flavor. So we're going to add 3 tablespoons of the olive oil to this saucepan. Our garlic is starting to brown a little bit, so we are going to take this off of the heat and set it aside. While the lentils are going, we can get started on our dessert. What we're going to be doing is making stuffed dates. In ancient Egypt, they wouldn't have had sugar to make desserts with. What else would they have had that would have been really sweet? Honey, right? But dates are also incredibly sweet. It would have made a great dessert. They made all kinds of desserts out of dates and honey. So for this dessert, we're going to use these dates, and we're going to use some cinnamon. We're just going to use the ground cinnamon, which is easy, but cinnamon is actually from the bark of a tree. And so here's some actual cinnamon. We could grind that up, but we're not going to bother. That would be pretty hard. And we're going to use some cream cheese. And ancient Egyptians did use some cheeses, some soft cheeses like cottage cheese. Plastic knife works great for this activity. So all we have to do is slice the date open on the top a little bit, like that, and then take a knife and grab some cream cheese and put some cream cheese inside, like that. Then take some cinnamon, and we'll sprinkle some cinnamon out on a plate, and then we can roll our date in the cinnamon. And we have just made a really nice treat that's pretty healthy for dessert. As an option, you could add some slivered almonds. Almonds grew in ancient Egypt too. We're going to put our lentils into this bowl. Wow, 1 cup of lentils makes a lot of lentils. Okay, now we're ready to assemble all of our ingredients. So we're going to add our garlic and olive oil right in. Oh wow, they smell so good. We're going to add our parsley. And then we're going to add the rest of our olive oil, which is another tablespoon. Put that on top. And that is it. There's our warm lentil salad. Oh wow, doesn't that look so healthy and delicious? There we go, we've created such a healthy meal, just like the ancient Egyptians would have. And we've got our flatbread too to go with it. And then we've even made our little dessert. So I hope you get to enjoy this fun and easy meal.